There are some phone calls a family never wants to get. For the Busches, it came on a Wednesday evening in May, and by the following afternoon, the racing world had lost one of its most decorated and most misunderstood champions. Weeks later, his widow would finally explain what she whispered to him as he lay dying, and why 4 short words on Instagram would come to define how she carries her family forward. Kyle Busch spent more than 2 decades building a resume that few drivers in NASCAR history can match. Across the Cup, Xfinity, and Truck Series, he compiled 234 career victories, the most of any driver across NASCAR's 3 National Touring Series, and he won Cup Series championships in 2015 and 2019. He held the record for the longest active streak of consecutive winning seasons in Cup history, a stretch running from 2005 through 2023. A bipartisan resolution later passed by the U.S. Senate would go on to formally recognize that streak, along with his standing as the winningest driver in the sport's national series. But in the 3rd week of May 2026, none of that mattered as much as a lingering cough. According to reporting from the Associated Press and a death certificate later obtained by Us Weekly, Busch had been fighting bacterial pneumonia for days, possibly weeks, before it was correctly identified. Drivers are creatures of habit and stubbornness, and Busch was no exception. He kept racing through it. On May 20th, while running a practice session inside a racing simulator at the General Motors Charlotte Technical Center in Concord, North Carolina, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to a hospital. The following day, May 21st, Kyle Busch died. He was 41. The Busch family, NASCAR, and Richard Childress Racing released a joint statement confirming the loss, calling him a driver whose sharp wit and competitive spirit sparked a deep emotional connection with race fans of every age. 2 days later, the family shared the medical explanation the public had been waiting for. The pneumonia had progressed into sepsis, triggering complications that overwhelmed his body far faster than anyone could have anticipated. He left behind his wife, Samantha, their 11-year-old son, Brexton, and their 4-year-old daughter, Lennox. For nearly 3 weeks after the funeral, Samantha Busch said almost nothing publicly. Her first statement, posted on Instagram on June 5th, was an outpouring of gratitude rather than grief laid bare. She thanked fans for the flowers, the meals, and the countless acts of kindness that had carried her family through what she described as the most heartbreaking stretch of their lives. She wrote that there were moments when the weight of the loss felt impossible to carry, and that she had leaned on her faith to get through them. It was the second post, 5 days later on June 10th, that revealed something she had kept entirely private until then. Samantha shared a photograph of herself with Brexton and Lennox, standing together on the grass infield at Charlotte Motor Speedway, looking at a stylized number 8 that track crews had painted into the ground in her husband's honor. In the caption, she finally told the world what had happened in the hospital room during Kyle's final hours. "In the hospital, I made Kyle a promise," she wrote. "I promised him that I would do everything I could to help our children pursue their dreams no matter what." It is worth sitting with what that sentence actually asks of a person. Samantha wasn't promising to keep his memory alive in the abstract, or to hold the family together in some general sense. She was making a specific, binding commitment, at his bedside, about the futures of 2 children who did not yet understand what they were about to lose. For Brexton, she explained, that dream already had a name: racing. What makes Samantha's account resonate beyond the racetrack is the distinction she was careful to draw. She did not describe Brexton's love of racing as something Kyle imposed on him, a legacy handed down out of ego or ambition. "It wasn't a dream Kyle chose for him," she wrote. "It was something they shared." She described countless hours the two of them spent working on cars together, dreaming together, building a bond around a sport they both genuinely loved. She said racing is what lights Brexton up, and as long as it remains the dream in his heart, she intends to be right there beside him. She was equally clear about the other side of that promise. If either of her children eventually wanted something different, that would be more than acceptable. The commitment she made was never really about stock cars or checkered flags. It was about giving her kids permission to keep chasing whatever it is that makes them come alive, whether or not it looks anything like their father's career. That same message touched on Lennox, who had just turned 4. Samantha revealed that the family had already bought her a go-kart for her birthday. She acknowledged, with a kind of honesty that doesn't try to soften anything, that if her daughter someday wants to get behind the wheel, it won't be the same as having Kyle beside her. But the family, she said, would do their absolute best. The Instagram post arrived one day after Brexton had climbed back into a race car for the first time since losing his father. In the first week of June, less than 3 weeks after Kyle's death, the 11-year-old competed in the Cookout Summer Shootout at Charlotte Motor Speedway, a youth racing event held in the shadow of the same track where NASCAR's biggest names compete every year. He finished 6th in one race and 2nd in another, close enough to a win that the near miss surely stung, even for a kid handling grief with more composure than most adults could manage. Samantha described the experience of watching him race again as something that cut 2 ways at once. Watching Brexton back at the track is both heartbreaking and beautiful all at once, she wrote, because there are moments when I catch a glimpse of Kyle in him. She described seeing the same determination, the same spark, and for a moment feeling as though a piece of her husband were still there with them. She closed the post by acknowledging what the racetrack now represents for a family in mourning. The Busches have been part of the Charlotte Motor Speedway community for nearly 20 years. It is where she and Kyle built much of their relationship, where their children grew up, and where some of the family's happiest memories were made. She admitted that every visit now comes with the ache of an obvious absence. The person who should be standing beside them isn't there anymore. But she said the track is also one of the only places that still feels like home when so much else feels unfamiliar. She ended the post with the 4 words that fans and media outlets would repeat for days afterward, "So we race on." Kyle wasn't the only Busch racing fans had grown up watching. His older brother, Kurt, a NASCAR Hall of Famer and the 2004 Cup Series champion, stayed silent publicly for weeks before posting his own tribute on Instagram on June 8. The 2 brothers had raced against each other from childhood go-karts all the way to the sport's biggest stages, and together they hold the distinction of being the only sibling pair in NASCAR history where both drivers have at least 30 Cup Series wins apiece. Kurt thanked fans for the outpouring of support and reflected on decades spent competing against, and learning from, his younger brother. He wrote that the 2 of them were more than just fierce competitors, describing a relationship built on pushing each other and growing from the rivalry. He closed his statement with a line that landed hard across the racing community. "My heart is broken, but I know your spirit will always ride with me. Rest easy, little brother." NASCAR's response to Busch's death extended well beyond social media tributes. Just days after he died, Richard Childress Racing, the team Busch had driven for since 2023, announced it would suspend use of his number 8 car entirely, shifting to a number 33 for the remainder of the season. The team explained that Busch had been instrumental in designing the stylized 8 that had become synonymous with him, and that no one can carry it forward to the level that he did. The number, RCR said, would be reserved and waiting for Brexton, whenever he is ready to race in NASCAR's top series. A commitment team owner Richard Childress later reaffirmed applies even if Brexton eventually chooses to drive for a different organization altogether. The gesture echoed a similar moment in NASCAR history a quarter-century earlier, when Childress made the decision to eventually bring back the number 3 for his own driver, Dale Earnhardt, after Earnhardt's death at the 2001 Daytona 500, a number that would later be handed down to Childress's grandson, Austin Dillon. At the Coca-Cola 600, the first Cup Series race held after Busch's death, NASCAR built an entire pre-race ceremony around his memory. Samantha, Brexton, and Lennox stood on the front stretch alongside Kurt and Kyle's parents as a stylized number 8 was displayed on the infield grass. NASCAR President Steve O'Donnell delivered a brief tribute, telling the family directly that the sport considered them family forever, and telling the children specifically that their father loved them with all his heart. The field observed a moment of silence, and fans across the grandstand held up 8 fingers during the race's 8th lap. Amid the ceremony, 11-year-old Owen Larson, the son of Cup Series driver Kyle Larson, quietly stepped away from his own family to comfort his friend Brexton, a small, unscripted moment that circulated widely afterward as a reminder of how far the loss had rippled through the sport's next generation. For most of his career, Kyle Busch wore the label of NASCAR's antagonist almost as comfortably as his fire suit. Fans nicknamed him Rowdy, booed him from the stands, and openly rooted against him for years. It's a reputation that made the private glimpses shared after his death feel especially jarring. One of the most talked about came from Dale Earnhardt Jr., a longtime rival turned friend, who discussed his final exchange with Busch on his podcast several days after the funeral. Earnhardt explained that the two men had been trading texts the day before Busch died, coordinating plans for Busch to race one of Earnhardt's late model cars in an upcoming short track series event. Busch had asked what paint scheme to run, and Earnhardt told him he could choose anything. Busch's response was to request Earnhardt's own famous former Cup Series number for the car. Earnhardt agreed on the spot. According to Earnhardt, Busch answered with an exploding head emoji and 2 words, "Race fans." It was, by Earnhardt's account, a small window into a version of Busch that the cameras rarely captured, a man who still got genuinely excited about racing for its own sake, stripped of rivalries and reputations. Other people close to Busch echoed similar stories in the weeks that followed, describing a man who quietly checked in on teammates, who had recently taken to bringing Brexton along on hunting trips and go-kart outings, and who spent some of the final healthy days of his life simply being present with the people he loved. Samantha and Kyle's connection to Charlotte Motor Speedway wasn't incidental to their story, it was central to it. The couple met and built much of their life together around the sport, and their family's charitable work, the Bundle of Joy Fund, grew out of their own experience with infertility, helping other couples trying to start families of their own. That history is part of why Samantha described the racetrack as one of the only places that still feels like home to her, even now. It's also why the image of her children staring at a painted number on the infield grass carries so much more weight than it might for a family without 2 decades of memories built on that same patch of asphalt and grass. Brexton, for his part, had already been racing competitively since he was 5 years old, long before his father's death forced him into the spotlight in a way no child should have to experience. By the time he lined up for the Cookout Summer Shootout weeks after losing his dad, he had already collected more than 100 wins across various junior circuits, dirt micro sprints, bandoleros, late models, building a resume that suggested he might have a future in the sport with or without the family name attached to it. Not everyone around the sport handled the loss, or its aftermath, gracefully. NASCAR Hall of Famer Tony Stewart, who had been Busch's teammate, spoke bluntly in the weeks following the death about what he saw as an uncomfortable double standard in how some fans reacted to the news, pointing out that a driver who had spent years being cast as the sport's villain deserved better than a cold public response once he was gone. Richard Childress, too, used his own public remarks not just to talk about wins and championships, but about the personal relationship the two men had built away from the cameras, including trips they'd taken hunting together and the growing bond between Childress's team and the young son Busch had started bringing along to the shop. That tension, between the driver fans loved to boo for 2 decades and the father, husband, and friend so many people described in the weeks after his death, became one of the more talked-about threads of the entire story. Busch had spent years fully aware of his own reputation as NASCAR's antagonist. He leaned into it, embraced the nickname Rowdy, and rarely seemed bothered by the boos that followed him into victory lane. But the private accounts that surfaced after May 21st painted a fuller picture, a man whose sharpest edges were mostly reserved for the racetrack, and who spent an outsized amount of his time away from it quietly checking in on people, mentoring younger drivers, and building the kind of family life that had little to do with the persona fans thought they knew. By the time the U.S. Senate passed its bipartisan resolution honoring Busch's career in mid-June, an unusual tribute for an athlete, sponsored jointly by senators from Nevada, his home state, and North Carolina, where he lived and raced, the shape of what came next for his family was already becoming clear. Samantha Busch was not interested in turning her grief into a public spectacle, and she wasn't interested in pretending the pain had eased. What she offered instead, in her own words and on her own timeline, was an explanation of the promise that is now steering her family forward, that whatever her children dream of doing, she intends to help them get there, because that is what she told their father she would do. It's a strange thing to sit with, a promise made in the quietest, most devastating moment of someone's life becoming the loudest, most public commitment of the months that followed. But that contradiction may be the whole point. Grief rarely announces itself the way people expect. Sometimes it looks like an 11-year-old finishing second in a go-kart race 2 weeks after burying his father. Sometimes it looks like a 4-year-old's birthday present sitting in a garage, waiting for her to be ready. And sometimes it looks like 4 words at the end of an Instagram caption, offered not as closure, but as a promise still being kept, one race at a time. Sources: NASCAR.com, Associated Press, via ESPN, the Busch family's official statements released through NASCAR and Richard Childress Racing, Samantha Busch's Instagram posts of June 5th and June 10th, 2026, as reported by On3, Yardbarker, Heavy.com, Us Weekly/Yahoo, and AOL, Kurt Busch's Instagram statement of June 8th, 2026, as reported by Racer, Fox 8/Nexstar, and E! News, Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s Dale Jr. Download podcast, as reported by E! News, Yahoo Sports, Wide Open Country, and Country Rebel, Richard Childress Racing Team statements, as reported by Fox News, Yahoo Sports, and Sportskeeda, Fox Sports and Whiskey Riff coverage of the Coca-Cola 600 tribute, and press releases from the offices of Senators Catherine Cortez Masto, Jackie Rosen, Ted Budd, and Tom Tillis.